Don't be fooled by the apparent simplicity of the poem London by William Blake. If you're studying this for the AQA anthology, then I think this is probably the most complicated poem in the collection and is typical of Blake, who really takes economy of language to a new level in his poetry. It's one of those poems that needs a lot of background and contextual information in order to get the most out of it. And so we're just going to spend a few minutes looking at some of those, because I think it will really help you to understand what Blake is trying to convey in this poem. In 1762, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau published The Social Contract, in which he theorised reforms to political establishments in order to establish a more equal society. In particular, he argued against the idea that monarchs were authorised to rule by God, and stated that it should be the people alone who should have that right. The publication was so controversial that it was banned in both his home country of Geneva and France. Rousseau himself predicted off the back of this an age of revolution, and in fact the work is often cited as a key inspiration behind the French Revolution of 1789. The first line of the first chapter of this political philosophy is what I've written down here for you. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And the chains that Rousseau is referring to are the restrictions placed on human beings by powerful institutions such as the monarchy, law, religion, but also through our own selfish actions in trying to benefit ourselves rather than acting to advance society as a whole. Whenever I've taught this poem, I find it quite useful to look at this, which is a painting by William Hogarth called Gin Alley, painted in 1751. And to the left of this picture here, we see depicted the well-fed representation of the law, standing in front of and almost barring the entrance to the solid-looking courthouse, and he towers above the beggars here who gnaw on bones beside animals, and drunk mothers too wasted to care for their neglected children, and soldiers still in uniform who have become the embodiment of death and starve in the streets. To the right are more images of corruption, the buildings falling down, a man has hung himself, and everywhere are suggestions of violence and death. So what does all this have to do with the poem London? Well, Blake too is concerned about the restrictions placed upon individuals by powerful institutions and how these result in a lack of freedom. I wander through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most, through midnight streets, I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the new-born infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. In the first two lines of this poem, I wander through each charted street immediately single this theme. The word wander has a free and aimless quality to it, like the speaker is going where he wants without clear purpose. But this is contradicted with the adjective chartered, which has a number of connotations. Firstly, a chart is a map, which suggests that in fact the speaker is not walking freely, but in some controlled and mapped out area. A charter is also a piece of legal documentation which grants someone a prescribed set of rights, such as the right to wander around the streets of London, for example. But implicit within this piece of law is the understanding that the grantor of these rights remains sovereign and superior. Blake is arguing that under those circumstances man is not free to wander, and so this urban setting is restrictive to the imagination. Even nature is subject to the same law and conditions, as the Thames too is chartered. The word mark appears 3 times over the next 2 lines. Look, we've got it here and here and here. And it has 2 distinct meanings. Initially, Blake is observing, and to mark is a verb meaning to see. Whereas in line 4, the word is a noun meaning imprint or sign. And so in this pair of lines we see Blake moving from observation, which allows for the freedom of imagination, to a permanent brand which has literally left its mark on the people of London. And what marks does he observe? Well, the alliterative pair of weakness and woe, in other words, weariness and sadness. And these expressions are universal. Blake sees them everywhere. Now, I'm going to make a point here about the beat that the poem follows, and Blake wrote this deliberately in a combination of iambic and trochaic meter. Now, if you've watched any other of the videos of mine, you'll know that iambic lines have the emphasis falling on every other beat, and I've tried to emphasise that here. I wander through each chartered street. Trochaic lines have the emphasis falling on the first beat rather than the second, and lines 3 and 4 of this first stanza are good examples of this contrast. The first line here is iambic, and mark in every face I meet, whereas the second is trochaic, marks of weakness, marks of woe. And this technique helps to emphasise certain words. That's why poets use them. And in this particular example, it falls on the word mark, because Blake wants you to watch and see and observe the suffering of the people. If we now have a look at the second stanza, we'll notice that the word every is repeated again and again and again, as Blake continues to show us images of human suffering. Adults and children cry in pain and fear, furthering the notion that this misery cannot be outgrown but will exist throughout a human lifetime. In this line, Blake writes in every voice, in every ban. And the word ban is quite an interesting choice. It could simply refer to restrictions placed on human beings, literally being banned from doing certain actions. Or perhaps Blake is also referring to this word, which I put in the corner here, bans, which is one of the legal steps we go through in England before getting married, and it works something like this. Before England went through its rapid process of industrialisation, people would live in smaller communities or parishes and very rarely have cause to move or journey outside of them. At the centre of these communities would have been the church, and it would have been expected that the population attend the weekly service on a Sunday. The word bans means announcement, and so over several successive Sundays, the names of those who intend to marry would be read out, so that objections could be made and illegal marriages prevented. Now remember that Blake is concerned with controlling nature of powerful institutions in this poem. He's already attacked systems of law in the first stanza, and it is the institution of marriage that he's critical of here. So what is he criticising? Well, the first two stanzas really build to a crescendo in line 8. Blake has told us that as he wanders around the streets of London, he sees and hears human suffering. He hears it in every child, every adult, every partnership. And what he hears is the central metaphor in this poem, the mind-forged manacles, deliberately placed in the centre of a poem, on line 8 of a 16-line poem. And these mind-forged manacles are the very chains which Rousseau referred to in The Social Contract, which I mentioned right at the beginning here. Manacles are chains, binds like handcuffs, but these are made or forged in the mind of everyone. So they're not real or tangible things, but metaphorical shackles placed upon people by the way they think and behave. And it suggests the people are full of weakness and despair, restricted and tied down, unable to express themselves with energy or imagination. These manacles are an inward psychological manifestation of the mapped out, chartered city of the first stanza, where the imaginative vision is transformed into something without any independence or thought. And while you're still trying to digest all of that, we'll have a look at stanza 3, which I'm afraid doesn't get any more straightforward, because this is largely concerned with the impact that the upper classes have on the lower classes. Two more powerful institutions appear in the crosshairs of Blake's poem, the church and the monarchy. So in line 9, we continue to hear the cries of suffering from the people of London, this time specifically chimney sweeps. Now, chimney sweeps were small boys and occasionally girls who would have either been paupers or orphans and would have consequently found themselves in the London workhouses. Now, workhouses were funded by the local parish, and so it was within their financial interest to get as many of them apprenticeships, usually as sweeps, as possible. And this is exactly Blake's criticism. The very institution which should be safeguarding these vulnerable children. The church is the very institution which is selling them into a life of misery. And so the cries of the sweeps metaphorically turns to soot, which blackens the walls of the church. The church are responsible for the suffering of the children, and this guilt and appalling lack of responsibility is represented through the soot-covered walls of the church. The same device is used in the next pair of lines, where the unfortunate soldier whose final exhalation suggesting death is represented through this sigh, metaphorically then turns to blood which runs down the walls of the palace and other powerful institutions whose actions have led to the suffering of people. Now, in the same way that the first two stanzas of the poem build towards that central line about mind-forged manacles, so the whole poem experiences a second crescendo in the final stanza, introduced by this superlative "but most," where Blake almost seems to dismiss the horror that he's witnessed and described so far, and now focuses our attention on what he sees as his most shocking observation. And this is to do with the poverty and corruption of the young. The subject of this stanza is both one that is youthful and newborn. And you may recall the image presented by Hogarth in the painting that started this video. At night, Blake continues his wandering through the streets of London and hears again the cries of those who suffer. A young prostitute swearing at her young crying child suggests that the misery from old to young is starting all over again, while the word blight in the final line is suggestive of VD, a common sexually transmitted disease suffered by those who frequented prostitutes, completely replaces and corrupts this institution of marriage. And this final image is particularly savage, that marriage itself as an institution leads to death. It's also interesting to note that the men, infants, chimney sweeps, soldiers and harlots never appear in person, but are only ever known by the traces they leave behind.